The vote board showed 31 prescient, 29 developing, 44 peer, 67 undetermined. She noticed Velishin was molting. The Scythian chair never molted during votes. 3 centuries of presiding, and his outer dermis had shed exactly twice. Both times during classified security crises, the council still did not discuss. Now pale gray flecks drifted from his 7 limbs like ash from a fire someone had forgotten to name. Commander Yusra Malik watched the flecks settle on the polished table between the Earth delegation's folding chair and the empty space where a real chair would go if they had one. She did not move. She had learned stillness in rooms that made this one look gentle. The chamber held 214 delegations. They had stopped pretending to read documents. Earth is constitutionally unclassified, Velishin said. His voice carried the particular weight of a man saying something he had not believed possible 6 hours ago. The words landed in the many-frequency quiet of a room where every species processed surprise differently. The Branari delegate had doubled in size. The Kith were clicking in frequencies that meant we did not account for this. The craft delegation's lead attaché was already typing. Yusra watched the board. 31 prescient, 29 developing, 44 peer, 67 undetermined. No majority, not even close. In 214 sessions of this council, Velishin continued, no civilization has ever received a classification vote with no majority in any category. Under Galactic Registry Protocol, the challenge is upheld by technical default. Earth's classification, as prescient developmental anomaly, is. He stopped. The molt was worse now. His primary manipulator limb had left a gray smear on the session record. A Scythian aide stepped forward with a cloth. Velishin waved him off with the particular irritation of a man who had just realized he was going to have to draft a procedural opinion about something that should have been a formality. Yusra stood up. She did not stand for drama. Some things are said standing. The folding chair scraped against the chamber floor, a small sound in a room designed to absorb sound, which meant everyone heard it. Commander Malik, Velishin said, the chair has not yet a real seat at this table. Her voice did not carry, it landed. There is a difference. Carrying is volume, landing is weight. Her mother had taught her that in a different room, across a different table, with immigration forms spread between them like evidence of a crime she had not committed. Voting rights, Yusra said. Treaty protections, formal recognition under galactic law. The chamber had gone quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when everyone is listening and no one is breathing. The many-frequency kind of quiet that is actually many sounds, all choosing simultaneously to wait. She looked at Velishin directly. His stress molt had not stopped. Pale gray flakes drifted between them. And someone rewrites the charter. She let that sit. The classification system you are using was designed for a galaxy that did not include us. It needs to be updated. She sat back down. The folding chair made the sound again. She picked up her water glass from the dispenser that had been marked non-functional when they arrived. She pressed the button. It worked. She drank. Still terrible. She had expected that. Outside, in the dark between stars, 1,000 ships held their position. They had been still for 11 hours. They were not impatient. They were what they had always been, a product of everything Earth had survived to build, waiting with the particular quality of something that has been ready for a long time and is not surprised to finally be here. The ships were named for things that had refused to stop. Endurance, resolute, long road, patience. 47 standard days earlier, which was to say, 63 years after the first invitation and approximately 4 minutes after Yusra stopped being able to feel her own face. She had been staring at a different screen. The inbox had 847 unread messages. She said it aloud because saying it aloud made it real. Owen Price, the analyst standing behind her, had stopped breathing somewhere around minute 2 of her silence. He was 24 years old and had never seen Commander Malik not move for 4 consecutive minutes. She was not a woman who held still. The oldest one, she said, is 63 years old. Owen made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound of a junior analyst realizing that the thing he was looking at was going to change his entire career, and also possibly the entire trajectory of human civilization, and he was going to have to write the after-action report about it. The auto-archive filter flagged them as low-priority diplomatic correspondence, he managed. The system marks anything from an unregistered sender domain as secondary. The Galactic Council's domain wasn't in our approved registry. Yusra turned to look at him. So every message they sent for 63 years went directly into the spam folder. Owen did not argue. Yes, ma'am. She turned back to the screen. She was not reading. She was scanning subject lines the way a person scans a car crash, not wanting to look, unable to stop. Mandatory attendance. Civilizational classification hearing, 2061. Follow-up civilizational classification hearing, second notice, 2062. Final notice. Civilizational status review, Earth Sector, 2063. Invitation. Annual Galactic Council Summit. Attendance required for recognized civilizations, 2064. Ray Earth's absence from annual summit. Formal inquiry, 2064. Ray Earth's absence. Second formal inquiry, 2065. She stopped scrolling at 2067. There were still 800 more messages below it. Where is Director Calloway? In a budget meeting. Pulled him out. He's with the Senate Oversight Committee. Pulled him out. Owen left. Yusra did not watch him go. She was reading the most recent message, dated 3 weeks ago, from something called the Galactic Council Civilizational Registry Office. The language was formal and bureaucratic in the way that only institutions with too much power and not enough accountability ever managed to be. It did not say Earth was primitive. It did not say Earth was small or unimportant or beneath consideration. It used cleaner language than that. It said Earth had been formally classified as a prescient developmental anomaly. It said this classification had been under review for 61 years and had now been finalized given Earth's continued non-participation in Council proceedings. It said this classification entitled Earth to observation status, meaning Council representatives could visit and document the civilization's progress, but Earth would have no voting rights, no treaty protections, no formal recognition under galactic law. It said Earth was, in the Council's official language, a curiosity. Something moved behind Yusra's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something older and quieter than anger, the thing that lives underneath it. She had seen this language before. Not in space. Not in any Council document. She had seen it on her mother's asylum application. Filed 3 times. Rejected 3 times. The language of bureaucratic systems explaining in very clean and formal words why your existence is noted, but your participation is not required. The door opened. Director Calloway came in with his jacket half-buttoned. Owen was 2 steps behind him. Commander Malik, I'm in the middle of... Sit down, Director. He looked at her face and sat down. She turned the screen toward him. She let him read the subject lines. She watched his face go through several stages of a very specific kind of human experience. The experience of realizing that a catastrophic failure happened very slowly over a very long time and at no single identifiable moment. Ya Allah, she said under her breath. Not for him, for herself. This was the archive filter, Calloway said. This was a system error. We can send a response. We can explain. We're going to do more than explain. Yusra. They classified us, Director. She said the word classified the way you say a word when the word itself is the offense. They ran a hearing about the legal status of 8 billion people. They ran it 61 years ago. They ran it without us. They finalized it 3 weeks ago, and they put us in a category that means we don't get a seat at the table. She paused. Our invitation to that hearing is in a spam folder. Calloway rubbed his face. He was 62 years old and had spent 40 of those years in Earth's diplomatic corps. He had negotiated ceasefires, resource accords, and the Unified Fleet Infrastructure Initiative that had redirected most of Earth's military capacity away from killing itself and toward building things that would last. He had seen a lot of rooms. This room was a new one. What do you want to do? She had already pulled up a different screen. The United Earth Fleet Registry. Active vessels, current operational status. The number sat at the top of the page in plain, unremarkable font, the way truly large numbers sometimes present themselves without drama because they don't need it. 1021 active warships, ranging from the small and fast patrol class to the deep space carrier groups that had never once been deployed beyond Earth's own solar defense perimeter. Because Earth had, for the last 40 years, been busy redirecting, not building toward a war, building away from one. The distinction mattered. It had always mattered. Yusra had written her doctoral thesis on it. She looked at the number for a long moment. Then she pulled up a new message, addressed to the Galactic Council Civilizational Registry Office. She typed 4 lines, read them back, deleted the 3rd line, which had been too sharp, and replaced it with something that would read as polite to anyone who didn't know how polite worked. She showed it to Calloway. He read it twice. This is going to get a reaction. Good. A significant reaction. I know. Yusra, 1,000 warships is not a threat, she said. It's a delegation. There's a difference. She hit send. Owen, still standing by the door, cleared his throat. Should I tell the Senate committee you'll be available after lunch? Yusra was already pulling up navigation charts. Tell them I'll be available in about 6 weeks, she said. Tell them we have a meeting to attend. She looked at the spam folder one more time. 847 messages. 63 years of invitations. 63 years of Earth being somewhere else, doing the hard and ugly work of surviving itself, while the galaxy held meetings about what to call the quiet little planet that never showed up. She closed the folder. They were going to show up now. The thing behind her eyes that was older and quieter than anger settled into something that felt, if she was honest, a lot like purpose. She had her mother's jaw and her mother's patience. Both had been tested by worse rooms than this. A galactic council chamber was just another room. She would bring a folding chair if she had to. The Valoran diplomat's name was Sitha, and she glowed soft amber when she was professionally neutral, which was most of the time. She had been dispatched to Earth as a courtesy, a formality. The council had approved her visit under the Observer Protocol, the same protocol used when a Tier 1 civilization wanted to document the development of a pre-classified species without interfering in the natural arc of their progression. She had done this work before. She had visited 3 prepient worlds. They had all been fascinating in the particular way that small and earnest things are fascinating. She had written good reports. She had felt something like fondness for the creatures she observed. She had not expected Earth to send a car, not a diplomatic shuttle, not a ceremonial escort vehicle. A car, a black ground-running road-bound vehicle that arrived at her landing site on time, driven by a human named Philip Akefer, who shook her hand without hesitation, did not react to her bioluminescence in any way she could read, and asked if she needed the air temperature adjusted. She said she was fine. He said long flight. She had traveled 6 light years. She said yes. He nodded like this was completely reasonable information to receive before 8:00 in the morning, and merged into traffic. Sitha looked out the window. She had studied Earth from orbital scans and council data files. She had read the historical records as much as the council maintained, which was not extensive given the civilization's non-registered status. She had expected something consistent with a Tier 2 developmental civilization: organized settlements, primitive transit infrastructure, resource consolidation patterns consistent with early industrial expansion. What she saw out the window did not look primitive. It looked like a civilization that had made a series of extremely difficult decisions and was still paying the price for some of them, and had made peace with that. Philip drove. He did not explain the city. He did not perform it for her. He existed in it the way people exist in places they have known all their lives, without self-consciousness, without distance. She found this more disorienting than anything else. They arrived at the shipyard at 800 hours. Admiral General Kofi Sunt was waiting at the entrance. He was 61 years old and built like something that had been tested by weather over a long period of time and had simply declined to change shape. He shook her hand. His grip was steady and entirely without aggression, which was somehow more intimidating than aggression would have been. "Welcome to Dock 7, he said. He did not give her a presentation. He did not hand her a briefing packet. He simply walked, and she followed, and the shipyard opened around them like a sentence that kept adding clauses. Dock 7 held 43 vessels in various stages of maintenance. They were large, not the largest she had seen. The craft hegemony maintained ships that made these look modest, but large, and numerous, and clearly not ceremonial. These were working ships. The humans moving across them moved the way people move when the work is not for performance, fast and specific and completely indifferent to being watched. "How long has this dock been operational?" she asked. "This specific dock since 2019. But the program it's part of, the Unified Fleet Infrastructure Initiative, started in 2041. And how many docks are there?" Kofi looked at her with the particular stillness of a person, deciding how much of the truth is kind to deliver at once. "We can walk through them if you like." They walked through Dock 8, Dock 9, Dock 10, Docks 11 through 16, which were connected by a transit rail that took 12 minutes to traverse. Dock 17, which was the largest and which held a class of vessels Sitha had no catalog entry for. By the time they reached the observation level above Dock 22, her bioluminescence had cycled through amber to pale gold to a color she had not shown in a professional context in many years. She was not cold. She was not performing a response. The color simply happened to her. "You had wars," she said. She said it the way a scientist states a variable. "Constant wars for millennia," Kofi said. "With each other." "Yes." She looked at the ships, at the humans on them, at the particular economy of movement that comes from people who have been doing something so long that the doing is in the body. "And then you stopped." "Mostly," Kofi said, "we redirected." That word sat in the air between them. Redirected. The kind of word that does enormous work quietly. She thought about what redirected meant in the context of a species that had been at war with itself for the entirety of its recorded history, and had then, over the course of roughly 40 years, pointed that energy somewhere else. Not out of peace. Not from some sudden flowering of interspecies love. From nothing more elevated than practical necessity. They had looked at each other across the last major ceasefire and done a very human calculation. They had decided that killing each other was expensive and that building was cheaper, and that if they were going to build, they might as well build something that would last. "So the Council classification," Sitha said carefully, "describes Earth as prepient, a developmental anomaly." Kofi didn't look at her. He was watching a repair crew working on the underside of a carrier 3 docks below them. "I know what the classification says. Does that bother you?" He considered the question, with what she was beginning to recognize as characteristic Kofi thoroughness. The quality of a person who does not give answers they haven't thought about. "My grandmother," he said, "was born in a village in Ghana that didn't appear on any official map until 1987. The regional government had a classification system, too. The village was listed as an unregistered rural settlement, ineligible for infrastructure, ineligible for formal school funding, ineligible for medical supply chains." He paused. "She lived in that village for 60 years. It existed for hundreds of years before that." Sitha waited. "The map not having it didn't make it not real," Kofi said. "It just made the map wrong." She turned back to the ships. The pale gold was still in her skin. She could not make it stop. "Your message to the Council," she said. "Commander Malik's message. It said you were coming to the next meeting." "Yes. The next meeting is in 3 weeks, in the Outer Rim Council chambers. That is 6 light years from here." "I know. You have had no diplomatic presence, no registered ships, no council recognition. You have never attended a session. To arrive with, 'We'll have our paperwork in order.'" He said this with the particular serenity of a man who had been working on something for longer than most people understood. Sitha had a question she had been holding since Dock 7. She held it for another moment. Then she asked it. "How many ships are you bringing?" Kofi finally looked at her. The expression on his face was not pride. It was not a performance of power. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the look of a person who has prepared for a very long time for something that is now finally beginning. "Enough," he said, to make the point without making a threat. The council chamber had assigned Earth a visitor's observation alcove. It was a glass-walled box on the upper tier, normally reserved for non-registered entities, journalists from allied worlds, and educational delegations from prepient civilizations who had earned temporary access through the developmental observation program. It had no table. It had no communication terminal. It had padded bench seating and a water dispenser that did not work. Yusra looked at it for approximately 4 seconds when they arrived. Then she went back to the transport, found a folding chair from the equipment supply, carried it through the main corridor of the Galactic Council chamber, past 214 registered delegations who watched her with a variety of expressions ranging from confusion to deep concern, and set it down on the floor of the main chamber. At the table, not in the glass box, at the table, her colleagues on the Earth delegation were Fleet Legal Counsel Harriet Doyle and Cultural Liaison Officer Nathan Voss. Harriet watched Yusra place the chair and said nothing for a moment. Then she opened her briefcase, removed a small placard and placed it in front of the chair. It read Earth. She had made it on the flight over. Card stock. Black marker, not laminated, it was not printed. It was exactly what it looked like. Something made by hand because there had not been time to do it any other way, and because the point was not the quality of the placard. The point was the chair. Nathan looked at the two of them. He was 34 years old and had spent 7 years studying Galactic Standard Diplomatic Protocol, all 11 recognized languages of the Council's primary species, and the 43 formal procedures that governed session entry for visiting non-registered entities. He had prepared extensively for this moment. He sat down in the chair next to Yusra and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Scythian Council chair was named Velishan. He was ancient in the way that ancient things can sometimes be. Not old in the sense of worn or diminished, but old in the sense of having simply been continuous for a very long time. 7-limbed, pale gray. His species registered stress as a physical shedding of their outer dermis layer, which the council literature referred to as a stress molt, and which looked to human eyes like a person slowly generating dandruff in real time. He did not begin to molt immediately. He was, to his credit, a professional. The floor recognizes, he said in Galactic Standard, which Yusra's earpiece translated with a half-second delay, that there appear to be individuals seated at the primary delegate table who are not on the session registry. Commander Yusra Malik, Yusra said, United Earth Fleet, Earth Diplomatic Corps, we received your invitation. A pause. Earth does not have a registered seat at this table. Earth has a chair, Yusra said. We brought it. Across the chamber, 214 delegations were doing what delegations do when something unprecedented happens in a room that has not had anything unprecedented happen in a very long time. They were reacting. The reactions were varied. Several species reacted in colors, several in sound frequencies. Several simply sat very still, which Yusra recognized as its own category of reaction. Sitha, the Valoran diplomat, was seated in the Valoran delegation box on the mid-tier. Her bioluminescence was pale gold. She had been pale gold since she arrived. Yusra noticed this and filed it somewhere useful. Velishan consulted something off-screen. Earth's current classification under Galactic Registry Protocol 7, Section 4, is Prepient Developmental Anomaly, Class C. Under this classification, Earth representatives are entitled to observation access only. Participation in primary chamber proceedings is not. Yusra placed a document on the table. It was printed, bound, 1,412 pages. She placed it without ceremony, the way you place a thing when you want the thing to speak for itself. Earth's formal response to the prepient classification, she said, including a full review of the evidentiary basis for the original 2061 hearing, the procedural irregularities in a hearing conducted without the subject civilization's knowledge or participation, and Earth's annotated commentary on every galactic treaty signed in the last 63 years that affected Earth's solar system and surrounding space without Earth's consent or representation. A longer pause. That document is 1,412 pages, Velishan said. 1,412, Yusra confirmed. We had time on the flight over. Harriet kept her face completely still. Nathan studied a point on the wall with great focus. The chamber was not quiet. Quiet was the absence of sound. What the chamber had was the presence of many different kinds of sound happening at different frequencies in different sections simultaneously. The conversational equivalent of a building settling after a significant impact. Velishin set down his materials. He seemed to be making a calculation of his own. Something about his posture shifted, not dramatically, just a degree or two. The way a professional shifts when they have accepted that the next several hours are not going to resemble what they planned. "Commander Malik," he said, "Earth's fleet registry as of this morning's update from our monitoring systems shows over 1,000 active vessels currently positioned at the outer edge of this system's approach corridor." "Yes. Is this a military posture?" Yusra considered the question the way her mother had considered questions from people who held forms that could say yes or no to her future, with patience, with care, with the very specific type of restraint that is not weakness, but is the decision made consciously not to spend all of your cards at once. "We were invited to a meeting," she said. "We wanted to be prepared." The chamber noise shifted register. On the upper tier, a craft delegate was speaking rapidly to his aide. Velishin was very slightly beginning to molt. The Branari delegate, a species that registered extreme emotion as a sudden expansion of their outer membrane, so that they briefly appeared to double in size, was notably and unmistakably larger than they had been 2 minutes ago. But the humans at the table were not doing any of this. Harriet had opened her briefcase and removed a stylus and was taking notes. Nathan had produced a thermos of coffee from somewhere and poured a cup. Yusra sat with both hands on the table and looked at the council chair with the particular expression she had inherited from her mother, from her grandmother, from every woman in her family who had ever sat across a table from someone who held a form. Not anger, not a performance of confidence. Something quieter, the look of a person who has already decided they are not leaving. Velishin called a 20-minute recess for procedural review. Yusra poured herself water from the dispenser that had been marked non-functional. She pressed the button. It worked fine. She drank it. It tasted terrible. She had expected that. She looked at the placard on the table. Earth. Black marker on card stock. Not laminated. Behind the glass of the observation alcove they had not used, a small group of educational delegates from a prescient world she didn't know the name of were pressed against the glass, watching. She looked at the placard. She had seen that look before, too, on her own face once, years ago, before she had a uniform and a title and a fleet at her back. When she was still a girl, watching adults sit at tables she was not allowed to approach, holding forms that controlled the shape of her life. She had decided something that year. She had decided it quietly and without announcement, and she had spent every year since building toward it. She reached over and straightened the placard. Earth. The craft delegation's motion came 5 minutes into the recess. Gorathal, their lead delegate, a being whose species had been the largest single military power in the Council for 4,000 years, submitted a written motion to have Earth designated a threat civilization, pending a full military review. The language was careful. It did not accuse Earth of aggression. It simply noted that a civilization with over 1,000 warships and no diplomatic history represented an unquantifiable risk profile and should be classified accordingly, while the Council conducted a thorough assessment. Velishin read the motion. He looked at the Earth delegation. He looked at the craft delegation. He tabled the motion for procedural reasons. Yusra watched this happen and understood that tabling was not the same as defeating. The motion was waiting. It would come back. She was ready for when it did. The recess ended. The session resumed. The craft delegation's second motion came 15 minutes later, not a threat designation this time, but a request for a full accounting of Earth's fleet composition, armament specifications, and operational doctrine. Purely for informational purposes, Gorathal said. Transparency builds trust. Harriet leaned over to Yusra. That's intelligence gathering, she said quietly. They want our technical data before they decide how scared to be. Let them ask, Yusra said. Formally, we'll give them everything. No classification, no redaction. Harriet raised an eyebrow. That's not how military intelligence works. That's how trust works, Yusra said. They've never seen a civilization do this before. They don't know what redirected means. So we show them. Harriet made a note. The session continued. Outside in the dark between stars, 1,000 ships held still. They had been holding still for a very long time. It was not patience that kept them still. It was purpose. The same thing that keeps a held breath still. Not absence of power, presence of it. Waiting. Phase 3, confrontation, second half. The craft delegation's third motion came during the session's 4th hour. Gorathal had switched tactics. Instead of demanding data or threat designations, he asked a question. Commander Malik, he said, his translator rendering his species' harmonic speech into galactic standards flattened tones. Earth's fleet registry indicates vessels named for abstract virtues. Endurance, resolute, patience. These are not military designations. What do they signify? Yusra did not answer immediately. She had learned that the space before an answer was sometimes more valuable than the answer itself. They signify, she said finally, things that refuse to stop. Gorathal's translator paused. His species processed meaning through pattern recognition rather than syntax. A 4-second delay meant he was running the phrase through multiple interpretive frameworks and finding all of them incomplete. Refused, he repeated. Structures do not refuse, structures operate or fail. Refusal implies agency. The ships were named by people, Yusra said. The people named them after other people who kept going when keeping going was not the logical choice. The Endurance was a ship that got crushed by ice in Earth's polar region. The crew survived against every reasonable expectation and walked out. The Resolute was a vessel sent to find them. The Patience is named for a quality Earth spent most of its history not having. She paused. We're learning. The chamber did something that Sitha would later struggle to describe in her report. It was not laughter. Laughter was too human a word for what happened across 214 species with 214 different ways of processing unexpected information. But something shifted. A relaxation she had not seen before. The Branari delegate stopped expanding. Several delegates who had been typing stopped typing. Velishan's molt slowed. Gorathal's translator was silent for 6 seconds. Then, your species was at war with itself for most of its history. Yes, you redirected your military capacity outward, rather than dismantling it. Yes, the Council's classification system assumes that military capacity and diplomatic maturity develop in proportion to each other. Earth's profile breaks this assumption. We break a lot of assumptions, Yusra said. We're a species that hears you cannot go there and starts packing. It's not a virtue, it's just what we are. Harriet made a note. Nathan poured more coffee. The chamber's temperature had shifted. Sitha noticed this. As the environmental systems adjusted for the body heat of 214 delegations who had stopped holding quite so still. Velishan called for the vote. The process took 43 minutes. Each of the 214 delegations cast their ballot in sequence, by species order determined by the Council's founding charter, a document written 10,000 years ago by species who had never imagined a civilization like Earth, and had therefore not written any rules about how to handle one. Yusra watched the board. Prepient 11 votes in the first minute, developing 8, Pier 4, undetermined 14. The numbers climbed. At the 10-minute mark, Prepient had 19, developing 16, Pier 12, undetermined 31. At 20 minutes, Prepient 24, developing 22, Pier 19, undetermined 44. The craft delegation voted at 22 minutes. Gorathal's species was 11th in the founding order. He cast his ballot, Pier, with a deliberation that suggested he had been negotiating with himself until the last possible second. The Valoran delegation voted at 24 minutes. Sitha had prepared her ballot 3 days ago and had not changed it once. She cast undetermined. At 30 minutes, Prepient 28, developing 26, Pier 35, undetermined 56. At 40 minutes, Prepient 30, developing 28, Pier 42, undetermined 64. At 43 minutes, 31-29, 44, 67. No majority. The chamber held its breath. in 214 different ways. Velishin stared at the board. His molt had not stopped. Pale gray flakes drifted onto the session record, onto his primary manipulator limb, onto the polished surface of the council table where Earth's handwritten placard sat in the space between a folding chair and 1,000 years of procedural precedent. In 214 sessions of this council, he said, no civilization has ever received a classification vote with no majority in any category. He turned to look at Yusra. Earth is constitutionally unclassified. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. She had written the 1,412-page document. She had brought the folding chair. She had sat at the table for 11 hours without once checking the time. But knowing something is coming and being in the room when it arrives are not the same thing. Something moved behind her eyes. Not victory, not relief. The thing that lives underneath both of those things. The quieter thing. The thing her mother had carried out of rooms where forms said no and she had said I'll wait, and waiting had finally meant something. She stood up. Not for drama. Some things are said standing. A real seat at this table, she said. Voting rights, treaty protections, formal recognition under galactic law. She looked at Velishin directly. And someone rewrites the charter. The chamber was quiet. The many-frequency kind of quiet that is actually many sounds, all choosing simultaneously to wait. The classification system you are using was designed for a galaxy that did not include us. It needs to be updated. She sat back down. She picked up her water. Still terrible, she had expected that. Outside, in the dark between stars, 1,000 ships held their position. They had been still for 11 hours. They were not impatient. They were what they had always been, a product of everything Earth had survived to build, waiting with the particular quality of something that has been ready for a long time and is not surprised to finally be here. Velishin opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The molt was worse now. His aide stepped forward with the cloth again. This time, Velishin did not wave him off. He sat very still while pale gray flakes were dabbed from his primary manipulator limb, his secondary limbs, the joints where his exoskeleton met the softer tissue of his throat. Commander Malik, he said, what you are requesting, a seat, is a revision to the Galactic Charter. The Charter has been amended 7 times in 10,000 years. Each amendment required a seat council chair. I'm not asking for an amendment today. I'm asking for a chair that isn't folding. She looked down at the placard. Card stock, black marker, not laminated. I brought my own because you didn't have one for us. That's fine. We're resourceful. But I'm not leaving this table until there's a real chair here. Not in the observation alcove. Not in a glass box. Here. She touched the table with both hands. We have been on the maps you don't look at for 63 years. We have been in the files you don't read. We have been in the spam folder while you held meetings about what to call us. She leaned forward slightly. Call us what we are. A civilization that was too busy surviving itself to notice you were trying to classify it. And now that we're here, we're not leaving. Phase 4, the moment, re-entered. The chamber sound returned slowly. Not with a rush. Not with applause. Applause was not a universal gesture, and several species expressed approval through means that would have been alarming to humans. The Branari delegate expanded again, but this time it was not fear. Sitha recognized the difference. The craft delegations at HFY had stopped typing. He was just watching. Nathan poured himself more coffee. Harriet continued taking notes. The session was not over, and there would be follow-up procedures. And there was always more work to do in a room after the moment everyone had been waiting for. Sitha's bioluminescence was pale gold. It had been pale gold since Dock 7. She had tried to cycle back to amber during the recess. She had tried to breathe the way her species breathed when they needed to reset their emotional palate. She had tried to think about the council's procedures, about her report, about the careful language she would need to use when she described this session to her superiors. None of it worked. She was still pale gold. She watched Yusra straighten the placard one more time. The human woman's hands were steady, not the steadiness of someone who was not afraid. Sitha had studied enough xenobiology to recognize the difference. It was the steadiness of someone who had decided that fear was not going to make the decisions. Sitha opened her terminal. She typed for 11 minutes. She did not pause. She did not revise. The words came in the order they came, and when she was finished, she had written something she had never written before and did not expect to write again. She recommended that the Council suspend its standard classification framework for Earth entirely, not assign Earth to a new category, not create a temporary designation. Simply acknowledge that Earth did not fit, that the framework was not wrong but was incomplete. That proceeding as if it were complete was a form of dishonesty the Council could no longer afford. She titled the document, Preliminary Assessment, Earth Civilizational Review, submitted for emergency session. She marked it priority urgent. She sent it. Then she sat back and watched the amber try to return. It was fighting against the pale gold. The pale gold was winning. She thought about the placard, card stock, black marker Earth. She had held official diplomatic credentials for 20 years. She had carried her documentation in a case sealed with Valoran state encryption, embossed with the Council's primary registry mark, backed by 4,000 years of continuous civilizational recognition. She had watched a human woman put a handwritten placard on a table and sit down in a folding chair. She had watched the handwritten placard hold. Velishin called a second recess. The chamber broke apart into small groups and urgent conversations. The craft delegation huddled in a cluster that Sitha had never seen them form before. They were not a species that huddled. The Branari delegate was speaking rapidly to his aide in a frequency that meant I need to write this down while I still remember the exact shape of it. The Kith were clicking. The Valoran delegation's second chair, a younger diplomat named Thesson, turned to Sitha with an expression she had never seen on his face. 67 votes for undetermined, he said. That's not a protest vote. That's people admitting they don't know what they're looking at. Yes, Sitha said. The craft are going to regroup. They're going to come back with a different motion, not a threat designation, something softer, something about temporary security protocols. They'll frame it as protective. I know. The humans, Sitha said, are not going anywhere. She looked across the chamber to where Yusra sat at the table. The Earth delegation had not moved during the recess. Harriet was still taking notes. Nathan was still drinking coffee. Yusra was still sitting with both hands on the table, looking at the placard. The Council's map, Sitha said, was missing a continent, and now the continent is here, and it's asking why the map didn't show it, and it's not being rude about it, which is somehow worse. Thesson waited. Worse because we can't dismiss them as angry. We can't dismiss them as unreasonable. They're not making threats. They're not making demands that violate protocol. They're just here. And they brought a chair. And the chair is at the table. And the placard says Earth in handwriting, and that handwriting is going to be in every report, every summary, every historical record from this session forward. She looked at her own hands, pale gold. And we don't have a word for what they are. Thesson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, maybe we need a new word. The session resumed. Velishin had stopped molting. His aide had removed the final flakes from his primary manipulator limb, and his exoskeleton had settled into the pale gray of a Scythian who was no longer surprised. He had moved past surprise into something else, something that looked to Yusra like a man who had realized he was going to have to rewrite the procedural manual and had accepted it. The chair has reviewed Commander Malik's request, he said. The request for a permanent seat at the primary delegate table with attendant voting rights, treaty protections, and formal recognition under galactic law is. He paused. Outside the scope of this session's agenda, Harriet's stylus stopped moving. Nathan's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. Yusra did not move. However, Velishin continued, the chair acknowledges that the current classification framework is, as Commander Malik has noted, incomplete. The vote's outcome, no majority in any category, constitutes a procedural anomaly that the Council cannot ignore. He consulted a document on his terminal. Therefore, the chair is establishing a special committee on civilizational classification reform. The committee will be tasked with reviewing the existing framework, assessing its adequacy for species that do not fit current categories, and submitting recommendations for revision to the full council within one standard cycle. He looked at Yusra. Commander Malik, Earth is invited to nominate a representative to serve on this committee, with a temporary seat at the committee table, pending final approval of the committee's charter. Harriet exhaled. Nathan set down his coffee. Yusra looked at the placard. Earth, cardstock, black marker. Not laminated. She thought about the spam folder. 847 messages. 63 years. She thought about her mother's asylum application, filed 3 times, rejected 3 times. She thought about the language of forms, the careful formal explanation of why your presence is noted but your participation is not required. She thought about Kofi's grandmother's village, on no map, ineligible for everything, still there. A temporary seat, she said. The committee's charter must be approved by the full council. Until then, I understand procedural requirements, Council Chair. I've read the charter, all 43 sections, including the appendices. Velishin's molt flickered, a single flake quickly suppressed. Then you understand that the committee's recommendations are not binding until ratified by. I understand that a temporary seat is not the same as a real seat, but it's a chair that isn't folding. She looked at Harriet. Harriet nodded once. Earth accepts the invitation. Phase 5 Aftermath. The chamber did not applaud. Applause was not a universal gesture, but something moved through the delegations. A release. A settling. The Branari delegate returned to his original size. The kith's clicking shifted into a frequency that meant conclusion reached. The craft delegation's cluster had not disbanded, but Gorathal was no longer typing. Sitha's bioluminescence was still pale gold. She was beginning to suspect it would stay that way for a while. She watched Yusra straighten the placard one more time. The human woman's hands were steady, the same steadiness, the steadiness of someone who had decided something a long time ago, and was now watching that decision arrive in a room full of aliens who had never heard of her mother's asylum application and did not know what a spam folder was. They would learn. The committee would meet. The charter would be drafted. The craft would negotiate. The vote would happen again in a different form on a different day with different numbers on a different board. But the placard was on the table, and the chair was not folding. Yusra did not leave the chamber immediately. She stayed at the table while the delegations filed out. The Branari delegate paused at the exit to look back at her. She did not know what his expression meant. His species registered emotion through membrane expansion, not facial features. But something about the way he held himself suggested acknowledgement. The craft delegation left without looking back. Gorathal walked with his attaches clustered around him, speaking in tones that did not carry. Yusra watched them go. Motion still on the table, Harriet said quietly. I know. They'll bring it back. They'll try. Nathan poured the last of his coffee. He had been drinking from the same thermos for 11 hours. Yusra wondered if it was still warm or if he had simply stopped noticing. Velishin surprised me, Harriet said. The committee, the invitation, that wasn't in the procedural playbook. He's practical, Yusra said. He looked at the vote board and realized he couldn't go back to the old categories. So he made a new category. Temporary, conditional, but new. It's not a seat. It's a chair that isn't folding. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your mother would be proud. Yusra did not answer. She looked at the placard one more time. Earth. The white space around it was not empty. It was the pause before the next sentence. The specific beat that belongs to things that have waited long enough and are now finally beginning to be heard. She stood up. She folded the folding chair. She picked up the placard. She walked out of the chamber. Outside in the dark between stars, 1,000 ships held their position. Admiral General Kofi Sunt watched the session feed from the flagship's bridge. Lydia Frost, his comms officer, turned from her station. Sir, she said, the committee. I saw. They're going to negotiate for months, maybe longer. They're going to negotiate for as long as it takes. He looked at the screen. The session had ended. The chamber was empty except for maintenance drones and the fading bioluminescence of Valoran diplomats who had stayed too long in rooms that had changed them. Lydia, he said, do you know why the ships are named what they're named? Because they refuse to stop, sir. Yes. He turned back to the viewport. The fleet stretched out before him. Endurance, resolute, long road, patience. "We're not here to threaten anyone," he said. "Sir, with respect, we already are, I know. But being a threat and threatening are not the same action. One is a condition, the other is a choice." He watched the ships hold still. "We're just here. Being here is enough." Sitha did not sleep after the session. She sat in her delegation quarters with the lights at half and her communications terminal open, and she thought in color the way her species thinks when something has not resolved into language yet. Her natural state was amber, steady, professional, the warm gold of composed attention. She had been cycling through amber since she left Earth and failing to hold it. The pale gold kept returning. Pale gold in her species meant something between awe and fear, not the fear of a threat, the fear of something true that is larger than your current vocabulary. She opened a new document. She stared at the header line, where she would normally type the subject. She typed RE, Earth Civilizational Classification Assessment. She deleted it. She typed RE, Emergency Status Review. She deleted that too. She sat back and thought about what she had actually seen. She had seen in the shipyards the product of 40 years of redirected violence. That was the right word. Kofi had handed her the word with the precision of someone who had been waiting to use it correctly. Redirected, not converted, not reformed. The same energy pointed somewhere else. She had seen in the council chamber 3 humans sit at a table they had not been invited to sit at, with a folding chair, with a handwritten placard, and not perform confidence, not perform calm, not manage their bodies the way every other species in that room was managing their bodies, controlling the colors, suppressing the sounds, holding the expansions. They had simply been calm. Sitha had studied xenobiology for 11 years. She knew what unmanaged calm looked like. It looked like the Ardini, a species whose nervous system generated almost no stress hormones, placid and lovely and almost entirely without ambition. It looked like the Marath, who processed anxiety so slowly that what felt like crisis to other species registered to them as mild interest. Human calm did not look like either of those things. Human calm looked like a structure that had been built over time and was holding its shape under load. She closed the document. She would write the report tomorrow. She would find the words eventually. Earth probably had a word for it. Earth seemed to have words for a lot of things that the galaxy had not yet found necessary to name. She looked out the viewport. The Earth fleet was still there. 1,000 ships holding still, not moving, not threatening. Just present. She thought about the placard. She had held official diplomatic credentials for 20 years. She had carried her documentation in a case sealed with Valoran state encryption, embossed with the Council's primary registry mark, backed by 4,000 years of continuous civilizational recognition. She had watched a human woman put a handwritten placard on a table and sit down in a folding chair. She had watched the handwritten placard hold. The pale gold was still there. She did not know a word for what she was feeling. She thought Earth probably did. The chamber was empty now. The maintenance drones had finished their cycle. The environmental systems had adjusted the temperature for the night cycle. The seats where 214 delegations had sat were folded or retracted or simply dormant, depending on the species. On the primary delegate table, in the space between the craft delegation's position and the Valoran delegation's position, there was nothing. The folding chair was gone. The placard was gone, but the table had a mark, a small scuff, a scratch in the polished surface. The kind of mark that a folding chair makes when it is placed in a place where folding chairs are not supposed to go. The maintenance drones would buff it out in the morning, or they wouldn't. Some marks stay. She was her mother's daughter. She had her mother's jaw and her mother's patience. Both had seen worse rooms. Neither had ever left a table before the work was done.